Recording start. The hiss and static of this recorder, a fragile membrane between crumbling reality and the void, is the only witness I have left. My name is Marcus Taylor. Current date unknown, but I estimate it as late autumn. The air carries a damp, vegetative rot, thick as a shroud. My breath, shallow and rattling in the confines of this forgotten attic, is a testament to the persistent dread that gnaws at the edges of my sanity. Below, the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling street lie submerged in an unnatural quiet, broken only by the occasional tail-wet scraping that seems to emanate from the very earth itself. A black cat, a gaunt spectre eye, have taken to calling soot, rubs against my leg, its purr a surprisingly robust thrum against the backdrop of this deathly silence. It's a small, absurd comfort in a world utterly undone. I'm somewhere in what was once the city, as industrial fringe, holed up in a derelict textile mill. This place smells of damp stone, ancient dust, and something else, a faint cloying sweetness that I've learned to associate with the nearby presence of the bloated, those pitiful husks that still shamble. I've been on the move for what feels like 35 lifetimes, though by the calendar, it's probably closer to 6 months since the initial collapse. My initial recordings were precise, dated, clinical. Now they read as desperate whispers into the more oblivion, a final testament before the inevitable. I do this, I suppose, for anyone who might stumble upon it, though the thought is a cruel joke. Who would be left to listen? Soot twitches an ear, its pupils dilating slightly. It hears something I don't, or rather it feels it's the distant, heavy thud. It was just last week, scavenging for potable water in the drowned suburbs, that I had to play the ultimate gambler. 2 of them, emerging from the viscous muck of a flooded alleyway, their forms distended, skin glistening with a dark sheen like ancient, wet leather. One had an arm that resembled a bundle of rotten roots, writhing with an unholy life of its own. I had only my makeshift spear, fashioned from a rusty pipe, and a shard of plate glass. The choice was simple: fight and risk infection, or run and risk being cornered in the maze of skeletal houses. I charged. It was a brutal, desperate dance, the air thick with their putrid exhalations. I remember the sickening crunch as the spear found purchase, the surge of adrenaline, the primal scream that tore from my throat. I didn't know I still had that kind of sound in me. The world outside, Marcus, is a rough place. There are no safe bets left. Recording end. Recording start. The air in this attic, once merely stale, has begun to thicken with the unmistakable scent of something akin to wet. Sun-baked meat left to fester, a putrid suggestion that the mill's lower levels are no longer merely deserted, but actively occupied by the encroaching, unholy blight. Soot curled into a tight black knot beside my knee, lets out a low, guttural growl, a sound more akin to a predatory beast than a house cat, its body vibrating with an unseen agitation. My own heart, a frantic metronome beneath my ribs, echoes the cat's unease. The flimsy boards beneath us groan with every subtle shift of the building, each creak a potential betrayal, a signal to whatever shambles below. I've been marking the days, or what I believe to be days, by the dwindling contents of my scavenged rations and the slow, agonizing descent into a peculiar form of lucid madness. The silence outside is a deception, a thin veneer over a world that screams silently. I've heard the distant, wet thumps, the squelching drags, the wet, ragged coughs. Tonight, however, there's a new sound, a ragged, wheezing respiration that seems to emanate from the very foundations of the old mill, an almost rhythmic exhalation that suggests something immense, something furritide, has taken residence. My hands, calloused and trembling, fumble with the worn tape recorder, the plastic casing slick with a fine sheen of sweat. I can taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue, a familiar companion. The wheezing below has grown more distinct, a sound like a wet bellow struggling to draw breath through a constricted throat. It is not the usual aimless shuffling of the bloated. This is stationary, persistent, and disturbingly fun-close. A thin, almost imperceptible tremor vibrates through the floorboards, a low, continuous hum that resonates in my teeth. I press my ear to a gap in the planks, the rough grain of the old wood biting into my skin. The stench of decay, previously diffused by the height, now rises in a concentrated wave, thick and cloying, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet note, like overripe fruit fermenting in a charnel house. It makes my stomach churn, a knot of revulsion and dread tightening in my gut, threatening to rise. Soot, now fully alert, paces a tight circle, its tail lashing, a low, continuous growl rumbling in its chest. It stares intently at a section of the floor, where a patch of dampness has begun to spread, leaching from some unknown source below. A single, dark droplet, viscous and slow, forms on the underside of a floor joist, then falls with a soft flip onto the dust-laden planks. It carries a faint, oily shimmer, catching the meager light. My refuge is compromised. The bloated or something infinitely worse is directly beneath me, and it is seeping through. My mind, a frantic, broken mechanism, races through the few options available. To stay is to invite a slow, agonizing death by proximity. To become another morsel for whatever putrescent horror has claimed the mill's ground floor, to be slowly consumed by its effluvia. To descend is a gamble, a desperate plunge into the unknown, but it offers the slim chance of egress, a path to the outside, to the cold, damp freedom of the ruined city. I retrieve my spear, its crude point glinting dully in the dim light filtering through the grimy attic window. The rough, splintered shaft feels reassuringly solid in my grip. Soot, sensing my intent, springs onto my shoulder, its claws digging lightly through the fabric of my jacket, a silent, furry anchor in this swirling vortex of fear. I eye the rickety attic hatch, its rusty bolt barely holding. It's the only way down. The air itself seems to grow heavier, pressing down on me, the mill groaning like a dying leviathan. I know the general layout of the lower levels, a warren of defunct machinery, collapsed beams, and the ever-present stagnant water. Each step will be a precarious ballet on the precipice of oblivion. The wheezing below intensifies, becoming a gurgle, then a series of rhythmic, wet shudders that vibrate up through the very bones of the building. Whatever is down there, it is not just breathing, it is struggling, and it sounds immense. Recording end. Recording start. The rusty latch, cold and gritty beneath my fingers, gave a final protesting shriek as I forced it open, revealing a square of impenetrable blackness that seemed to inhale the meager light from the attic. A wave of superheated, fetid air billowed upwards, thick with the concentrated essence of rot, stagnant water, and something else defuntuisi, a deep, fungal earthiness that spoke of long-buried things clawing their way to the surface. It was a physical blow, coating my tongue with a taste like old pennies and mold, making my eyes water and my gorge rise. Soot, a dark weight on my shoulder, dug its claws in harder, a low, continuous growl vibrating through its small frame. The wheezing from below, previously a distant, guttural sound, now filled the void, a ragged, wet exhalation that seemed to drag through constricted airways, punctuated by a series of unsettling internal fudderslaps. I lowered the rickety wooden ladder, each rung groaning under its own weight, a fragile bridge into the abyss. The air grew heavier with each descending step, pressing against my eardrums, coating my exposed skin with a clammy, invisible film. Below, the darkness was absolute, save for an occasional, faint shimmer on the surface of what I knew to be standing water, reflecting nothing but the deep, internal chaos of the mill. My feet splashed into the icy, murky water that covered the ground floor, a cold shock that instantly numbed my ankles and seeped through the worn leather of my boots. The water, surprisingly deep in places, swirled with unseen detritus, bumping against my shins, its surface disturbed by the continuous rhythmic undulations of whatever breathed beneath. The wheezing, now directly ahead, was no longer a general presence, but seemed to emanate from a specific, colossal form, a vast dark mass that gradually resolved itself from the gloom. It was an obscenity of biomass, a mound of distended, pallid flesh, fused with the ancient machinery of the mill itself. Tendrils, thick as a man's arm, and glistening with a viscous, dark fluid, snaked out from the central mass, attaching themselves to rusted gears, shattered looms, and crumbling brickwork, feeding, absorbing. The entire entity pulsed with a slow, sickening rhythm, its surface rippling like disturbed jelly, and from its apex rose a grotesque, tubular organ like a malformed proboscis that opened and closed with each labored, wet breath. This was the source of the monumental wheezing. I froze, spear clutched tight, the cold terror of physical pressure in my chest. This wasn't merely a bloated. This was a manifestation of the pandemic's ultimate, horrifying potential, a living, sprawling tumor that had consumed the very structure around it. It was both rooted and terribly alive. Soot, a sudden blur of black fur, launched itself from my shoulder, landing silently on a submerged metal beam, its back arched, hackles raised, a low, continuous hiss escaping its throat as it stared, unblinking, at the monstrous form. The air around the creature shimmered, not with heat, but with a strange internal effluvium, an almost visible miasma that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water uncontrollably. I could hear the faint, Wet-tearing sounds as its tendrils slowly, inexorably pulled apart the steel and brick, integrating them into its own expanding mass. A sudden, violent shudder passed through the colossal form, and a new sound emerged, a deep, resonant thrim-thrum, like a monstrous heart struggling to beat, causing the very water around me to vibrate. This was no place for escape. This was a place for absorption. I had descended into the maw. Recording end, recording start. The thrumming, low and resonant, vibrated not just through the water, but through the very bone of my skull, a resonant frequency of pure, unholy dread. My breath hitched, caught in a throat suddenly dry and constricted, as the appalling scale of the entity unfurled within the murk-laden air. It was a pulmonary horror, a colossal, throbbing organ of the mill's demise, its distended, grey-green surface glistening with a foul, viscid moisture that caught the faint, diffused light from distant, shattered windows. The tubular orifice, its edges rimmed with what looked like macerated metal fibers and gristle, pulsed with an irregular, wet rhythm, expelling gusts of air laden with the scent of unwashed grave, soil, and the bitter tang of industrial chemicals. This was no mere collection of bloated. This was their source. A cancerous heart beating at the core of the pandemic's genesis, consuming existence into its own putrescent form. Soot, her shadow against the greater darkness, remained frozen on the submerged beam, a low, continuous growl, a raw thread in the suffocating silence, its eyes, twin emeralds, fixed with unwavering intensity on the abominable mass. My spear, a pitiful splinter of defiance, felt utterly insignificant. A sudden, violent spasm rippled through the immense body, causing a ripple to spread across the stagnant water, disturbing reflections of shattered infrastructure. From the creature's flanks, where its tendrils burrowed deep into the collapsed masonry, a cluster of new, smaller protrusions began to emerge, gelatinous buds that pulsed with an internal sickly light. They were forming, I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, new orifices, smaller versions of the main breathing tube, each struggling to unfurl and draw in the contaminated air. The mill was not merely infested, it was surfeited, birthing. The thrumming intensified, a deep basso continuo beneath the wet wheezing, and the water around me began to churn with a slow, deliberate current, pulling me subtly towards the colossal form. My feet, numb with cold, struggled for purchase on the uneven, submerged floor. The path behind me, the rickety ladder, seemed miles away, swallowed by oppressive gloom. This was a trap, meticulously crafted by indifferent horror. My gaze darted around the cavernous space, seeking any elevated ground, any precarious ledge that might offer respite from the encroaching, viscous embrace of the water. A faint, almost imperceptible gleam caught my eye, high up on a remaining section of an old catwalk, just beyond the reach of the nearest, writhing tendrils. It was too far to jump, too treacherous to wade through the deeper, churning water directly towards it. But there, further to my left, was a stack of waterlogged, rotting crates, precariously balanced. A path, however perilous, presented itself. I began to move, slowly, deliberately, each step a conscious act of defiance against the overwhelming presence of the thing. The current strengthened, tugging at my legs, as if the monster recognized my intent, its pulmonary wheezing accompanied by wet, guttural exhalations that stirred the very air. Soot, with an agility born of pure instinct, darted ahead, leaping from beam to beam, its black form a fleeting shadow against darker depths. I followed, my spear held ready, the cold fear a constant companion, but now mingled with a fierce, desperate resolve. The air grew thick with a fine, aerosolized mist, exhaled directly from the creature's immense form, coating everything, including me, in a film of its putrescent essence. My lungs burned. This was not merely the air of the mill, it was the sun breath of the abomination. Recording end. Recording start. The mist, exhaled from the monstrous entity, was a chilling, pervasive shroud, carrying with it not just the stench of decay, but a strange, subtle chemical tang that burned in my nostrils and settled on my skin like fine, gritty dust. It was the monster's very breath, permeating the space, a living miasma that seemed to seep into my very pores. My lungs ached with each shallow intake, the air thick and heavy, as if I were breathing through wet burlap. Soot, nimble and silent, had already reached the first of the waterlogged crates, its silhouette momentarily stark against a sliver of light from a distant, high window before vanishing into the deeper gloom. I followed, each step a gamble against the treacherous submerged floor. The current emanating from the colossal organism was surprisingly strong, tugging at my legs, threatening to unbalance me. It felt like being caught in the digestive tract of some titanic, unseen beast, slowly being drawn towards its pulping core. The crates, bloated with absorbed water and softened by time, shifted precariously under my weight, groaning in protest as I clambered onto them. Splinters, thick and rough, dug into my hands, but the pain was a distant echo against the immediate, overwhelming threat. Below me, the water, now agitated by the creature's increased activity, sloshed with a sickening viscous sound and dark amorphous shapes, like bloated fish, brushed against the underside of the crates. I didn't dare look down. The tubular orifices on the main mass pulsed with renewed vigor, expelling not just mist, but now small, gelatinous clots that dissolved into the churning water, leaving behind faint trails of iridescent slime. The thrumming intensified, a deep resonant vibrato that rattled my teeth and made the very crates beneath me tremble. It was a sound of immense power, of unholy growth, of a presence that was both ancient and terrifyingly new. My escape was a desperate climb against the very tide of its existence. I hauled myself onto the precarious catwalk, the rusted metal groaning under my weight, a fragile vibrating ribbon of steel stretching into the gloom. Soot was already there, flattened against the cold metal, its pupils dilated to black pools, watching the monstrous birth mass below with an intensity that bordered on fear. The catwalk offered a momentary reprieve from the water's pull, but it also placed me higher, a more visible target. The chemical mist was denser up here, clinging to the metal, making it slick and treacherous. I could feel the microscopic particles settling on my tongue, leaving a bitter, acrid taste. The enormous proboscis of the central mass, previously focused downwards, now slowly, deliberately began to articulate, turning its grotesque slavering opening upwards, towards my position. It was a movement of terrifying intent, a slow, inexorable turning of a colossal head, a low guttural to gurgle, deeper and more resonant than any previous sound, rumbled from its depths. It saw me, it felt me, and now it was drawing its breath, not to sustain itself, but to fully exhale directly upon me, to engulf me in its foul, life-consuming essence. My precarious sanctuary was about to become my tomb. Recording end, recording start, the gurgle. A sound of immense, internal churning resonated through the very structure of the mill, vibrating up through the rusted catwalk and into the bones of my feet. It was not a sound of distress, but of monstrous intent, of a predator recognizing its prey. The colossal proboscis, its maw rimmed with glistening macerated tissue, continued its slow, deliberate arc, tracking my position with an unnerving precision. My breath caught in my throat, a dry gasp. Soot, pressed flat against the cold metal, let out a short, sharp hiss, its tail twitching frantically, every fiber of its being screaming danger. The mist, already thick, seemed to coalesce directly in front of the creature's orifice, forming a swirling, denser cloud that pulsed with a sickly greenish luminescence. This was no mere exhalation. This was a weapon, a concentrated blast of its putrescent essence, poised to strip flesh from bone, to dissolve sanity into the abyss. My mind, a frantic, broken thing, screamed for action, but my limbs felt like lead, paralyzed by the sheer, unholy scale of the horror before me. The catwalk, a skeletal bridge into the void, offered no cover, no escape. To run was to expose myself to the full, devastating force of the blast. To stay was to be consumed. A primal, desperate instinct surged, overriding the paralysis. I remembered the old mill's layout, the heavy rusted equipment that littered the lower levels, now half submerged. There was a chance, a sliver of desperate hope. If I could just reach the far end of this corroded walkway, where a section of the wall had collapsed, exposing a precarious rubble-strewn passage. It was a plunge into further unknown depths, but it was away from the looming moor. My spear, a pathetic twig in the face of such monstrosity, felt useless, but I clutched it tighter, a tangible anchor to my eroding humanity. With a sudden, explosive shudder that rocked the entire mill, the creature inhaled it, a deep sucking sound that displaced the very air, pulling at my clothes, threatening to rip me from my perch. Then, with a sound like 1,000 wet rags tearing simultaneously, Ituffy exhaled a concentrated, viscous jet of greenish-black mist, thick as sludge, erupted from its proboscis, slamming into the metal catwalk just feet from where I stood. The impact was deafening, a sickening splat that vibrated through the steel, followed by the immediate, horrifying sizzle of corrosive decay. The metal itself began to smoke, blistering and pitting with terrifying speed, the stench of burnt chemicals and rotting flesh intensifying to an unbearable degree. I instinctively dove, rolling across the slick, rusted surface, the searing, corrosive cloud washing over the space where I had stood moments before. So a dark blur had already launched itself into the ruined passage, its eyes for the first time betraying a flicker of raw, unadulterated terror. The blast was not merely gas. It was a physical force, a tangible manifestation of its hunger, and it was still coming. My escape was now a headlong flight into the darkness with the monstrous breath of the mill, thing hot on my heels. Recording end. Recording start. The acrid stench of the creature's corrosive exhalation, a burning chemical-laced decay, clawed at the back of my throat as I scrambled into the narrow rubble-strewn passage. The air here was marginally cooler, but thick with the fine, powdery dust of ancient mortar and shattered brick, each breath a gritty scrape against my raw lungs. Soot, a low, black streak, had already vanished into the deeper recesses, its silent speed a testament to its instinct for survival. I followed, my boots crunching on the fallen debris, each sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. Behind me, the metallic sizzle of the catwalk dissolving under the creature's putrid breath was a horrifying symphony of consumption, a reminder of how narrowly I had escaped its immediate maw. The thrumming, however, was still a deep, resonant presence vibrating through the very earth beneath my feet, indicating the monster's unyielding proximity. It was a constant internal tremor, a reminder that I was still within its immense pulping domain. The passage, a forgotten service tunnel, or perhaps a collapsed section of a loading bay, was a labyrinth of twisted rebar and precarious piles of broken concrete. Dim, fractured light filtered in through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, mocking my frantic progress. The air grew heavier, thick with the damp, earthy smell of deep subterranean spaces, mingled with an unsettling, cloying sweetness that was becoming horribly familiar. My hand, still clutching the spear, scraped against a rough, damp wall, leaving a trail of grime and a sharp sting. I could hear Soot's faint, agitated meows echoing ahead, a tiny, desperate beacon in the oppressive gloom. The sounds from the main chamber, the wet wheezing and the rhythmic slurp of tendrils, were now muffled, but the underlying frunthrum of the creature's colossal heart persisted, a low, menacing growl that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. It was as if the entire mill had become a single, vast organism, and I was merely an irritant burrowing within its guts. Suddenly the passage opened into a larger circular chamber, a forgotten cistern, or perhaps an old boiler room, its walls curving upwards into a domed ceiling lost in shadow. The air here was utterly still, heavy and cold, thick with the smell of standing water and a profound, ancient dampness. Soot was perched on a stack of rusted pipes, its back arched, staring intently at the center of the chamber. There, in the middle of a shallow pool of stagnant, dark water, stood a solitary figure. It was a bloated, but unlike any I had seen. Its form was less distended, more gaunt, almost skeletal, its skin stretched taut over sharp angles, the usual glistening sheen replaced by a dry, papery texture. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its mouth agape, revealing not the usual ruined teeth, but a cavernous, dark opening that seemed to lead into nothingness. From its chest, where a heart should have been, protruded a single thick, gnarled tendril, black and segmented, burrowed deep into the concrete floor. It was rooted, alive yet utterly motionless like a macabre statue, and from its gaping maw, a low, continuous buffet whisper emandled a dry, rasping sound that was not quite human, yet not entirely alien. It was a voice from the depths, and it was calling recording end. Recording start, the whisper, dry and papery like ancient parchment tearing, was not a coherent language, but a mosaic of fractured guttural sounds, a low, persistent incantation that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the cistern. It spoke of profound desolation, of a hunger that transcended mere flesh, a psychic resonance that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Soot, still perched on the rusted pipes, remained rigidly alert, its hiss a continuous low undertone to the bloated's eerie pronouncements. The creature, rooted to the floor by its single, thick tendril, seemed to draw power directly from the earth, its skeletal form a conduit for something far older and more malevolent than the pandemic itself. Its gaze, if one could call the empty sockets a gaze, was fixed not on me, but on some unseen point beyond, as if communing with an entity far removed from this decaying reality. The air in the chamber grew colder, heavy with a palpable sense of dread, the kind that makes the hairs on your forearms prickle and your breath catch in your chest. My spear, still clutched in my trembling hand, felt ludicrously inadequate against this new horror. This was not a bloated to be fought, but an oracle of decay, a chilling monument to the pandemic's deeper, more insidious purpose. The faint light filtering from above cast long, distorted shadows that writhed with an illusory life, turning the mundane rusted pipes and collapsed masonry into grotesque, watchful forms. I took a cautious step back, the shallow water in the cistern sloshing faintly around my boots, a sound that seemed deafening in the profound silence. The whisper intensified, shifting in pitch, and I caught fragments, not of words, but of twemby feelings, vastness, emptiness, and unyielding hunger, a slow, inexorable turning of the world towards an ultimate cessation. It was a psychic assault, seeping into the tender places of my mind, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of myself. As I retreated further, seeking the shadows of the chamber's periphery, the rooted bloated's head, with a slow grinding crunch of desiccated bone and gristle, began to turn. Its empty eye sockets, like twin abysses, rotated with unnerving slowness until they were fixed directly upon me. The whispering ceased abruptly, replaced by a single resonant click that echoed through the domed chamber, a sound of absolute unblinking recognition. Then, from the gaping maw, a thin, black tendril, impossibly long and whip-like, unfurled with a wet to snap. It was identical to the one rooting the creature to the floor, but this one was free, agile, and pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence that made it seem to writhe with a malevolent life of its own. It snaked through the air, testing, seeking, its tip twitching with an almost intelligent curiosity. Soot, with a furious yowl, launched itself from the pipes, a black projectile, striking the tendril mid-air. The creature, the bloated, didn't react. Its empty gaze still fixed on me, but the tendril recoiled with a violent, almost human twitch, revealing a patch of raw, glistening flesh where Soot's claws had raked across it. My path was blocked, and the oracle of the mill, now truly awake, was focused entirely on me. Recording end. Recording start. The black tendril, wounded by Soot's audacious strike, recoiled with a jerky, almost pain spasm, its internal luminescence flaring momentarily before dimming. A thin, viscous fluid, dark as crude oil, welled from the laceration, dripping onto the stagnant water below with a soft fit-plip. The rooted bloated, however, remained utterly motionless, its empty gaze still locked on me, its skeletal head tilted at that same unnatural angle. Its stillness was more terrifying than any frantic movement, a testament to a patience born of an abyssal, unimaginable time frame. Soot landed silently beside me, its fur bristling, a low, continuous growl rumbling in its chest, its eyes twin emeralds in the gloom, fixed on the recoiling tendril. The whisper, though momentarily silenced, still seemed to echo in the cold air, a psychic residue of its dread pronouncements. I felt a profound sense of despair, a crushing weight of inevitability. This was not a physical threat to be overcome with a spear. This was a manifestation, a gateway, and I was caught in its dreadful pull. The tendril, after its brief retreat, began to undulate with a slow, deliberate rhythm, its tip weaving through the air like a serpent searching for prey. It extended slowly, inexorably towards me, faster than I could react, yet with an unnerving, almost hypnotic grace. The air around it grew colder, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent like old blood and rust. I instinctively raised my spear, a futile barrier against an assault that felt both physical and metaphysical. The object was not to merely strike me, I realized with a sudden chilling clarity, but to touch, to make contact, to transmit whatever unholy essence resided within the rooted bloated. It was a conduit, and I was its intended receiver. My mind raced, desperate for an escape. A deflection, anything to break the inexorable advance of that probing black limb. Soot, sensing my paralysis, let out a sharp, urgent yowl, a sound of pure warning that pierced the oppressive silence. Just as the tendril's tip, glistening with that dark, viscous fluid, was inches from my chest, poised to make contact, a violent, seismic shudder ripped through the entire mill. The domed ceiling above groaned, showering us with fine dust and small pebbles. The walls of the cistern cracked with a sharp, explosive sound, and the shallow pool of water around my feet surged, sloshing violently. The rooted bloated for the first time reacted. Its skeletal form trembled, a dry, rattling sound emanating from its joints, and the tendril that had been reaching for me whipped back instantly, retracting into its chest with a wet twin snap. The immense foot-in thrum of the colossal organism in the main chamber, previously a distant bass, now intensified into a deafening, vibrating roar that shook the very foundations of the mill, an earthquake of organic power. It was no longer a distant presence. It was directly impacting the structure, tearing itself from its moorings or perhaps accelerating its horrific growth. The bloated in front of me, its empty gaze still fixed, began to emit a new sound, a low, continuous screech, dry and grating like metal scraping on bone, rising in pitch with each passing second, its rooted tendril visibly thickening, pulsing with dark energy. The entire mill was collapsing around us, and the Oracle of Decay was singing its final terrible song, recording end, recording start, the screech. Dry and grating like 1,000 rusty hinges twisting simultaneously, tore through the air of the cistern, a sound of profound agony and unholy ecstasy. It was the death rattle of the Oracle, or perhaps its birth cry, as the entire mill buckled and groaned under the immense, seismic thrashing of the colossal organism in the main chamber. Dust, thick and choking, rained from the fracturing dome, mingling with the spray of surging, stagnant water. The concrete beneath my feet convulsed, threatening to throw me off balance, and a chasm, jagged and deep, tore itself open across the floor of the cistern, directly between me and the screaming bloated. The rooted tendril, thick as an oak branch, pulsed with a frantic dark energy, visibly tearing at the concrete around it, as if struggling to free itself from the very earth it had consumed. Soot, a dark streak, launched itself from my shoulder, scaling a fissure in the wall with impossible speed, its eyes wide with a pure animalistic terror that mirrored my own. The air grew heavy, not just with dust and the stench of decay, but with a palpable pressure, as if the very atmosphere itself was being compressed, squeezed from existence. The colossal fulcrum from the main chamber was no longer a vibration. It was a physical force, rattling my teeth, blurring my vision, threatening to shatter my eardrums. I could hear the rending of steel, the explosive crumbling of brick, the groaning collapse of unseen structures above, each sound a hammer blow against the fragile shell of my sanity. The bloated, its skeletal form now writhing and jerking like a puppet on severed strings, began to retract its tendril from the floor, a sickening wet tearing sound accompanying its slow, agonizing extraction. It was not retreating, I realized with a fresh wave of horror, but preparing to find move, to follow to become unmoored from its ancient anchorage. Its head, still angled unnaturally, swung wildly from side to side, its empty gaze scanning the rapidly deteriorating chamber. My only path was the chasm, widening with every passing second, a gaping maw in the floor leading to unknown, lightless depths. To jump was a plunge into utter darkness, but to stay was to be crushed, either by the collapsing mill or by the liberated Oracle. A primal, desperate urge for survival, raw and unthinking, seized me. Soot, perched high on the crumbling wall, let out a sharp, piercing yowl, its gaze fixed on the chasm, then on me, then back to the rapidly detaching bloated. The creature, now almost entirely free, its tendril pulsing with a furious internal light, began to lean forward, its dry, papery form seeming to stretch, to elongate, its guttural scream rising to an unbearable crescendo. The stench of old pennies and damp earth intensified, coating my mouth, making me gag. I took a running leap, a desperate, clumsy vault over the widening abyss, my spear clattering against the concrete as I landed hard on the far side, my ankle twisting with a searing pain. A guttural roar, deep and resonant, shook the very foundations, originating from below the chasm, a sound of immense, subterranean power. The mill was not just collapsing, it was being torn devoured, from within digested by something far greater than even the main organism. The Oracle, caught between the two escalating forces, gave one final, ear-splitting shriek, its form dissolving, not into dust, but into a cloud of iridescent, phosphorescent spores that filled the chamber, burning my eyes, searing my lungs. The ground beneath me gave way, a final catastrophic groan of tearing metal and splintering wood, sending me tumbling into the black, roaring void below, the last thing I heard being Soot's desperate, fading yowl, swallowed by the darkness. Recording end.